Forget the demons and the masked killers. The scariest monsters don't need sharp teeth or horns. They only need time. Imagine a world where the trees are watching, where the soil remembers the rituals of 1,000 years ago, where your neighbor is guarding secrets far older than Christianity. That is folk horror. Tonight, we are digging up the roots of dread. 7 forgotten films where the land itself is the monster, and the deepest fear lies in isolation. Hey, welcome back to the channel. Before we dig deep into the Earth's darkest secrets, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and tell me in the comments below which pagan nightmare you find the most unsettling. In this video, we're traveling through the British countryside, the American farmlands, and the isolated corners of the world to find films that capture the primal, suffocating fear of the wild. These are the movies that prove you should never trust a smiling villager. Let's begin the ritual. Witchfinder General, The Conqueror Worm, 1968. Director Michael Reeves. The plot, England, 1645, amidst the chaos of the English Civil War. The plot follows Matthew Hopkins, a real-life historical figure who proclaimed himself the Witchfinder General. Accompanied by his cruel henchmen, he travels the countryside, using torture and fear to extract confessions of witchcraft from defenseless women, often for personal gain. When a young soldier returns from war to find his fiancée's family targeted by Hopkins, he embarks on a brutal quest for vengeance. The film is a masterclass in slow, historical dread, portraying the true horror of fanaticism and institutional violence, where the monster is a man of God. Production details, directed by the young Michael Reeves when he was just 25 years old. The film stars horror icon Vincent Price in the lead role of Matthew Hopkins, a performance he initially resented but delivered with chilling, controlled menace. The film was shot entirely on location in the English countryside, lending it a desolate, muddy, and historically grim authenticity. The budget was famously low, around £80,000, forcing the crew to rely on the natural, bleak beauty of the landscape. Reeves' original vision was a raw depiction of violence, but the film was censored and retitled for the American market. Failed modernity. The film predicted that the horror of mass hysteria and unchecked authority belonged firmly in the past, in the 17th century. Its failure as a prediction lies in the fact that witch hunts haven't disappeared. They've simply been replaced by modern forms of moral panics, digital mob justice, and political scapegoating. The film failed to predict the end of mass hysteria, only its change of costume. Fun fact, director Michael Reeves and star Vincent Price clashed constantly on set, with Price famously calling Reeves an arrogant child. However, after seeing the final cut, Price wrote to Reeves, praising his genius. Tragically, Reeves died just months after the film's release at the age of 25 from a prescription drug overdose, cementing this film as his sole, powerful legacy. The Blood on Satan's Claw, 1971. Director Piers Haggard. The plot: a young farmer plowing his field in 18th century England unearths a monstrous, one-eyed skull covered in hair and decaying flesh. Soon after, the local children begin acting strangely, exhibiting violent, predatory behavior and bearing patches of fur on their bodies. They form a deadly, seductive coven dedicated to reassembling the demon piece by piece. The film is a pure distillation of the folk horror trilogy, alongside Witchfinder and The Wicker Man. It is a mesmerizing blend of period drama, satanic panic, and visceral body horror, where the corruption of the land seeps into the local youth. Production details. The film was made in the immediate wake of the more successful Witchfinder General, utilizing a similar bleak, English rural aesthetic. It was filmed in the idyllic countryside of Buckinghamshire, deliberately contrasting the tranquil landscapes with the shocking sadism of the plot. The film's low budget meant costumes and sets had to be sourced locally, which paradoxically gave the village an authentic, lived-in dread. Despite being promoted as schlocky horror, the film's atmosphere and psychological depth were critically praised. Failed modernity. This film is obsessed with the idea of a satanic contagion spreading through the soil and corrupting the innocent youth. Its failure was in its setting. It assumed a return to paganism would be tied to rural isolation. Instead, modern contagion is technological and social, spreading faster than a demon's curse and corrupting the youth not through ancient rituals, but through digital isolation and viral information. The dread is the same, but the medium is different. Fun fact: when the film was first released in the US, it was marketed with sensationalized, lurid posters that bore almost no resemblance to the film's slow, atmospheric dread. It only gained its cult status decades later when critics recognized it as a fundamental piece of the emerging folk horror canon. Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, Valerie a Titan Divu, 1970. Director, Jaromil Jires. The plot: a surrealist, gothic fairy tale from Czechoslovakia. On the morning of her first menstruation, 13-year-old Valerie begins a dreamlike journey through a world populated by vampires, priests, lustful townsmen, and magical earrings. The plot is less a traditional narrative and more a sequence of stunning, often terrifying, gothic imagery. It explores the terror, confusion, and beauty of female adolescence and burgeoning sexuality through the lens of Central European folklore and dream logic. The horror is symbolic, tied to the fear of growing up and the predatory nature of the adult world that surrounds the isolated young woman. Production details: this film is a key work of the Czech New Wave, known for its visual poetry and rejection of communist-era social realism. It was shot in the historic city of Český Krumlov, whose medieval architecture gives the film a timeless, isolated feel. The director deliberately chose a highly stylized, non-linear approach, making the entire film feel like a waking dream. The film was controversial for its subtle political allegory and its frank, though often symbolic, depiction of young female sexuality. Failed modernity, Valerie presents sexual awakening as a descent into a magical, yet terrifying, world of gothic vampires and religious repression. It predicted the dangers of predatory adults in an isolated, morally rigid community. The real world's failure here is the persistence of that repression and predation, but it takes place not in an isolated medieval town, but in the glaring light of the digital world. The magic is gone, but the danger remains. Fun fact: the beautiful, highly romanticized imagery of the film inspired countless music videos and fashion photography campaigns decades later. The film's score is celebrated for its ethereal, almost childlike quality, which sharply contrasts with the dark and often disturbing subject matter, enhancing the film's unique sense of dread. Eyes of Fire, The Gardens of Eden, 1983. Director, Avery Krauts. The plot: in the 1750s, a group of religious fundamentalists, expelled from their home, attempt to establish a new settlement deep in the American frontier. They stumble into a beautiful, but terrifying, forest inhabited by malevolent spirits, Native American witches, and the ghosts of forgotten pioneers. Their isolation is absolute, and their fervent piety only serves to antagonize the supernatural forces of the woods. The film blends American colonial history with deep-seated folk belief, where the fear of the wilderness and the fear of God merge into a singular, overwhelming dread. Production details: this independent American film was shot entirely on location in rural Missouri, giving it an authentic, rough-hewn look that perfectly captures the isolation of the colonial frontier. The budget was minimal, forcing the director to rely on atmosphere, natural lighting, and unsettling sound design rather than expensive special effects. The film features stunning, often surreal visuals, such as glowing, floating ghosts and possessed trees, achieved through simple, effective camera tricks. The acting is stark and realistic, reflecting the religious fervor and desperation of the isolated settlers. Failed modernity. The film predicted that the greatest danger in founding a new society lay in confronting the ancient, untamed, spiritual forces of the wild. Today, we know the danger of forming isolated, fundamentalist communities isn't the ghosts they encounter, but the ideological and social rot they generate internally. The spirits in the woods were a distraction from the real, self-inflicted horror of their own rigid dogma. Fun fact: due to distribution issues and its highly experimental nature, Eyes of Fire was virtually impossible to see after its initial release. It became a legendary, lost film among horror fans for decades, only resurfacing in restored form thanks to the efforts of dedicated cinephiles, confirming its status as a genuinely unique piece of American folk horror. Pendulum, Kroni, 1974. Director, Zoltán Husárik. The plot, a deeply obscure Hungarian film, often cited as one of the most visually stunning and melancholic entries in the folk horror canon. The story centers on a young man who returns to his small, isolated village to fulfill a bizarre, centuries-old custom tied to his family's fate. The village is trapped in a kind of temporal loop, obsessed with ritual, death, and the weight of their own history. The plot is sparse and highly symbolic, focusing on the beautiful, yet suffocating, atmosphere of a community paralyzed by its own traditions. The horror is existential, the inability to escape the predetermined paths set by one's ancestors and the inescapable pull of the past. Production details. Pendulum is considered a masterpiece of Hungarian cinematography, renowned for its slow pace, incredible use of black and white photography, and dreamlike sequences. It was filmed in rural Hungary, capturing a sense of genuine isolation and the fading traditions of Eastern European peasantry. The lack of dialogue in key parts forces the viewer to focus on the visual storytelling and the heavy atmosphere. The director, Husárik, was known for his poetic style, and the film feels more like a visual poem about death and tradition than a conventional narrative. Failed modernity. This film predicted that the past would physically trap us, tying us to rituals and geographical isolation. Its failure is that we are no longer trapped by the land, we are trapped by information and nostalgia. While the Hungarian village couldn't escape its ancient rituals, modern society is drowning in manufactured nostalgia and endless reboots, proving that we can be just as paralyzed by the past, even without the ancient curses. Fun fact: due to its abstract and anti-commercial nature, Pendulum was rarely shown outside of film festivals and art house cinemas. Its reputation rests almost entirely on its breathtaking visuals, which have influenced countless avant-garde filmmakers in the decades since. The Appointment, 1981. Director, Lindsay C. Vickers. The plot: a British TV movie that achieves peak folk horror dread with a deceptively simple premise. A kind, middle-class father takes his family on an isolated holiday in the countryside to attend a school concert where his daughter is performing. However, his wife and daughter become increasingly distant, distracted, and strange, alluding to a mysterious appointment the daughter must keep on a specific date. The father's confusion and terror mount as he realizes the ancient, pre-Christian forces of the landscape are claiming his daughter. The horror is domestic, tied to the fear of losing a loved one to something ancient and incomprehensible that resides just beneath the manicured lawn. Production details. This film was produced for television by the BBC, known for its chillingly effective, low-budget horror specials. It was filmed entirely in the quiet, deceptively ordinary English suburbs and surrounding countryside. This choice is crucial. It brings the ancient dread of folk horror right into the heart of suburban normalcy, making the terror far more resonant. The movie relies on slow reveals, unsettling music, and the mounting paranoia of the father. The budget was modest, forcing the director to rely on atmosphere and sound design to carry the dread. Failed modernity. The film assumes a clear division between the modern, safe suburb and the terrifying, wild countryside. It failed to predict the blurring of these lines. Today, the ancient rituals of the past are less threatening than the digital shadows that follow our children, and the threat of the supernatural appointment has been replaced by the very real dangers of online grooming or radicalization. The evil is no longer under the stones, it's on the screen. Fun fact: The Appointment gained its cult status primarily through repeated late-night airings on British television, where its quiet, unsettling quality deeply affected a generation of viewers. For many, it remains a defining, yet rarely seen, example of British folk horror. The Gorgon, 1964. Director, Terence Fisher. The plot: a gothic horror masterpiece from the legendary Hammer Film Productions. Set in a small, isolated German village in the early 20th century, the community is plagued by a series of mysterious deaths where the victims are turned to stone. The villagers are convinced that the mythical Gorgon, Megara, is responsible, emerging from the ruins of a nearby castle under the full moon. When a professor arrives to investigate the murder of his son, he unravels a plot involving a family curse, ancient evil, and a secret kept by the terrified local doctor. The film is a classic blend of Gothic imagery and folk belief, showing how ancient mythology can survive and poison an entire isolated community. Production details. Made during the height of Hammer Film's success, the film stars genre legends Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, who bring gravitas to the high Gothic drama. The film was shot in the quintessential Hammer style, vibrant, lush colors, mist-shrouded sets, and beautiful, albeit clearly studio-bound, period settings. The budget was typical for Hammer at the time, allowing for detailed sets and rich costuming, which only enhances the film's sense of timeless, isolated dread. Director Terence Fisher was a master of the Gothic, injecting his work with a moral seriousness that elevated the material beyond simple horror. Failed modernity. The Gorgon presents mythology and ancient curses as a literal, terrifying threat, contained within the walls of a single, isolated village. Its failure is a matter of scale. It assumed these threats would remain geographically contained. The modern world failed to prevent the spread of localized folk beliefs. Instead, the internet allowed conspiracy theories and ancient mythological thinking to spread globally, poisoning modern discourse and uniting isolated people under shared, often destructive, folklore. Fun fact: The Gorgon is notable for being one of the few Hammer films of the era to focus primarily on a mythological creature rather than classic vampires or Frankenstein monsters. The film's moody cinematography and Peter Cushing's intense performance helped solidify its place as one of the most atmospheric horrors of the decade. You made it. You journeyed through the 7 cursed corners of the earth. You listened to the warnings of the soil, the whispers of the coven, and the inescapable truth that ancient dread never truly dies. These films prove that the scariest things are not out in space or in the future. They are buried in the ground beneath your feet. They were forgotten because we wanted to believe modernity could save us. We wanted to believe the land was passive. We were wrong. Now that the fear of the wild is in your head, I suggest you go check the shadows of your own backyard. If you enjoyed this dive into the roots of horror, please give the video a like, and click here to watch our next video on cult neo-noir thrillers. Until next time, stay vigilant.